Because it's an undefinable term, it can now be used, essentially targeted at anyone who goes against the political and cultural orthodoxies of the day. COVID just accelerated the process.
Right.
It all happens without anyone really knowing.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. As regular viewers of this channel will know, we have taken a bit of a special interest in disinformation recently, or rather anti-disinformation, this growing movement using that term that attempts to censor or raise questions about certain media providers, about certain content, all in the interest, supposedly, of protecting the public from dangerous material. The more we learn about it, the more, frankly, sinister it starts to seem. There are hundreds, literally hundreds, of entities that have sprouted up across the world that are basically acting as quasi-censors. In this episode, we are going to take a bit of a deep dive into them. We have as our tour guide Paul Coleman. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much.
So you are Executive Director of the ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, which is, let's just put it out there, a conservative Christian organisation in its founding. But that's not, frankly, the bit I want to talk about today. What I'm interested in is your experience as a lawyer, having dealt with this complex of organisations that are pushing censorship agendas over the years. I mean, you wrote a book about this. What year was that?
2016.
You actually know how these organisations operate. And what I'm hoping we can get from you in the next half hour or so is really a bit of a guided tour of the international organisations.
That sounds great. So we have offices in Geneva and New York at the United Nations. We have offices in Brussels at the European Union. We have offices in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights, and a few offices elsewhere. But it's through these ones in particular that we've been able to engage with the international institutions that have sprouted up over the last half century. And these are bodies that, some of them are well known. We hear about them in the news. Others are not. But I think for most people, the average person on the street, they have no real way to know just how large a lot of these institutions have become and how much impact they have on everyone's day-to-day life without them even realizing it. And so when we think about disinformation and think more broadly about the issue of censorship, we see a lot of censorship being driven by these international institutions. And I would say really in two main streams. One is the stream of hate speech regulation, calling certain things hate speech and then finding ways to prohibit it. And then the other stream would be misinformation and disinformation, which is a newer form of censorship.
Let's just spend a second on those two streams then, because those are the principal two rationales for restricting what people are allowed to say. So hate speech is basically, I remember it from the Tony Blair government, is when I first noticed it. Maybe it existed before as a concept. But it was this idea that we have progressed so far as a society that certain things are now beyond the pale. So overt racism, overt, anti-women talk, or anything that to a kind of sensible-minded liberal would seem outrageously offensive should now just not be allowed. That was the hate speech movement. Is that what it still is?
Yes, and we could go back even before the 90s. Really, the hate speech legislation started developing after the Second World War. And so it was this idea that in order to stop things like that happening again, we needed to place certain restrictions on speech. Because if we can nip these things in the bud, then we can stop these future bad actions from happening. And so in the book Censored, I write about this history over the last 50, 60 years. The problem with it is that this is an undefined, and I would say undefinable term. It's so malleable that what's happened is, over time, instead of it just being used to go after these far-right Nazis, whatever, which is how it was first sold to everyone, because it's an undefinable term, it can now be used essentially and targeted at anyone who goes against the political and cultural orthodoxies of the day.
Okay, so that's the hate speech current. Tell us about misinformation, disinformation. We've kind of come a cropper on that one recently. What's the history of that?
In a sense, misinformation, disinformation, you could trace back to the dawn of time. As a legal concept, it really started to increase in its usage around about the time of Brexit, the election of Donald Trump. So in short, this is the idea that things were happening in the political world that had taken those in power by surprise. Clearly, both things took a lot of people by surprise. And so the explanation for how such things could have happened was that, well, people are being fed misinformation, disinformation, or fake news. And that's the only possible explanation for these events. And so really from 2015-16, once Donald Trump started using the term fake news, he kind of destroyed it as terminology. And instead, misinformation, disinformation, and now latterly malinformation has now risen up. And then COVID just accelerated the process.
Right.
And so then a lot of countries just started passing these laws during COVID that are now continuing to expand. And now we're living in a situation where it has essentially become the mainstream that we are just surrounded by misinformation, disinformation, and that the only way that you or I can ever know what's real or not is if we have our information filtered to us by these international or governmental organizations.
So set out the architecture for us. Which of the international institutions is really pushing this? Should we start with the UN?
Yeah, okay. So the UN is probably the biggest, it's the most well-known, it has the biggest global footprint. Again, most people don't realize there's no need for them to even ever think about it. It's just the sheer size of the United Nations in terms of the amount of bodies and agencies and commissions and committees. And so there are 50, 60 plus, hard to count. But each one of these will have a budget of ranging between the tens of millions to the multi-billions.
So just to give a bit of a tour, so within the United Nations system, the principal organs, we've got Trusteeship Council, the Security Council, I think we know about that, we've seen that on our TV screens, General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, that's actually a bit of a new one to me, I confess, that's probably showing my ignorance, International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. And underneath each of these are dozens. Of entities, and they receive centralised funding. They employ many, I presume, tens of thousands of technocrats.
Yeah, and if you look and pick one out, I think the most famous UN organisation over the past 5 years is the WHO.
The World Health Organization.
The World Health Organization. And it's just a tiny dot. It's just one of just so many. These are huge organisations that each one, and they're almost impenetrable to regular citizens. There's no way for you or I as regular people to really engage with this process. And what they're doing is essentially hoovering up the decision-making processes from the national governments and the national level and deciding things in windowless rooms in the basements of Geneva and New York.
Why is it that the anti-disinformation / anti-hate speech quasi-censorship movements have been so pushed at the international level? National
governments are doing it as well, but there's a lot more pushback at the national level. Typically, your regular citizen does not like anti-free speech, censorial legislation. And if they feel that that's what's happening, then there is still, across most of the Western world, a degree of pushback. Whereas at the international level, it all happens without anyone really knowing. And even if they have a sense that something's happening, they have no real means of engaging with it.
In other words, the closer you are to popular opinion, the harder it is to pass censorship legislation. Or another way of putting it is that if popular opinion is the problem, people having inappropriate opinions, you can't really sit right next to them and say that what you're doing is inappropriate. The more hidden and high up the sort of stratosphere it is, the better.
That's exactly right. National governments know this, and so when I say that the international institutions are hoovering up that decision-making, the national governments, again I'm generalising here, they're okay with it because they're sort of outsourcing their responsibility. It's a win-win at the national level, because if the people are happy with this taking place, with their decision-making being outsourced, then the national governments within the national media will take the credit. If the people are not happy, then the national governments will blame the international institutions and say there's nothing that we can do about it.
So let's have a look at some actual examples then.
So in the past 9 months or so, we've seen the UN Human Rights Council pass a resolution on essentially religious hatred. But what this is in real terms is blasphemy laws for the 21st century.
So you've got a quote here from that. It calls upon states to adopt national laws, policies and law enforcement frameworks that address, prevent and prosecute acts and advocacy of religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence, and to take immediate steps to ensure accountability. It's a lot of words, but basically anything that can be shown to be connected to something that could be defined as religious hatred needs to be especially severely punished by national governments.
Correct. And this is being driven by some of the Quran burnings that took place in Scandinavia. And so this resolution is being driven by Islamic nations that would like some form of the equivalent of blasphemy laws in the West.
Which is ironic for the Human Rights Council, that it should come from nations that don't have a great track record in human rights. Next example, the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty. We've heard quite a lot about this. Some of our audience may have paid quite close attention to it. What's going on here?
Well, a lot of people are familiar or might have heard about the WHO Pandemic Treaty. A lot of attention was placed on some of the medical side of things. We focused on some of the censorship components of that treaty. It highlighted what it referred to as infodemics. Infodemics it defined as too much information.
Let me read the quote, actually. It says, the parties shall strengthen science, public health and pandemic literacy in the population, as well as access to information on pandemics and their effects and drivers. So far, it seems pretty reasonable. And here comes the key bit. And combat false, misleading, misinformation or disinformation, including through effective international collaboration and cooperation. It's the same idea, it's just being enshrined in actual law. So if member states or countries sign up to this, this means we will police anything deemed to be misinformation, including through international collaboration. So presumably these kind of quangos, if they identify a particular idea as officially misinformation, there could then be some kind of edict that went out to all the national governments saying, you need to censor this.
Right. And it's important to point out this is a treaty, this is hard law, and there is no current treaty that exists that has this sort of language to combat false, misleading misinformation. So this would be a first. And they introduced the treaty in October and hope to pass it by May. So they wanted to introduce a new form of hard law censorship in about a 6-month period, negotiated in Geneva, without anyone really having any access to it. But there's a good news story there that I'll save for later.
Okay, third example, just very quickly, is from the UN Global Digital Compact. They are talking about sexual and gender-based violence, which occurs through or is amplified by the use of technology. Again, like all of these things, a serious issue. It's important to say that. Nothing we're talking about here is to second-guess the idea that these are worrying things that need attention.
Correct. But then the comma, this next section, stands as a separate clause. So it's not even connected to the sexual gender-based violence. It then includes basically and all forms of hate speech and discrimination, mis- and disinformation, cyberbullying. And what I want to point out here is they never define these terms. You won't find, okay, so what is hate speech? What is discrimination? What is mis- and disinformation? And that's not an accident. It's a design feature. And the idea being, if we can just pass these sort of provisions banning things like hate speech and misinformation, and we just basically get to define it later.
So we've got this torrent of potential new treaties and legislation coming from the UN. Let's turn and look at the European Union. You've also done us a little bit of a map here of the different organs of government within the EU, and it is quite something to look at. If you are listening on the podcast, let me tell you, this is a complicated looking chart. Roughly speaking, there must be 100 different boxes on it. We have the European Council, the European Commission, Council of the European Union, not to be confused, and the European Parliament. They even sound so similar that you might get confused. And then many there's central banks, courts of justice, right down to investment funds, investment banks. Again, is it cynical or conspiratorial to suggest that this is complexity by design?
It is set up to be almost impenetrable to the average person, and I don't think that is an accident.
You could say that there are 28 or 27 or however many there are now nations. Of course, it's going to be a complicated thing to try and arrange government for all of them. But somehow it becomes a little bit more urgent in the context of this disinformation campaign. If ideas that individuals want to talk about are being disallowed, it feels intuitive that you want recourse or you want some kind of close understanding as to why that has happened. So the fact that this movement is being pushed at the highest level from these most complex branches of international government makes it extra eerie and unsettling to people.
Yeah, exactly. And it means that even if people have concerns about it, they're disheartened by the reality that there's nothing that they can do.
Let's have a look at what the EU has been up to, both under the hate speech banner and the misinformation banner. Past couple of years, what have you come across?
So on the hate speech side of things, again, this goes back further than the misinformation, disinformation. So they passed law in 2008, European Union law, that enforces all European Union nations to have at the national level certain hate speech laws. Then in 2016, no prior announcement, no one knew it was coming. They announced a code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online, which is a partnership with all the big tech companies. And then most recently, they want to extend their concept of EU crimes, which can be prosecuted multi-jurisdictionally, so across the European Union. They want to extend that to hate speech. Now, bear in mind, the only list of crimes that are currently there are things like terrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and so forth.
Really very, very serious
Very
crimes.
Serious, and they want to put hate speech into that category as well. And this was announced by Ursula von der Leyen to the European Parliament. She's the president of the European Commission. And the way that she announced this new huge shift to EU law was hate is hate, and no one should have to put up with it. I mean, that's literally the title of it. That's a quote, and it's the title of her speech to the European Parliament.
Meanwhile, there's another quote here from 2024 from the same President von der Leyen. The top concern, she says, for the next years is not conflict, not climate change, but misinformation and disinformation.
And so with the whole misinformation, disinformation is a whole package of EU law that's being developed. So Digital Services Act essentially regulates speech and other content online, Code of Practice on Disinformation. And then most recently, Ursula von der Leyen just gave a speech into which she referred to as the EU Democracy Shield. And the Democracy Shield is essentially protecting us from threats to our democracy.
You hear that a lot, don't you? The best way to protect democracy is to restrict free speech. That's weirdly becoming quite a popular argument.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is ostensibly through foreign interference. That was, again, one of the modern sort of terms that's been developed. And then increasingly just from anything that they see or perceive as threatening the status quo.
And the argument that has gained most traction, I hear this a lot, is that in order to have a functioning liberal democracy, you need to have common facts. Mm-hmm. And that means that if people are putting out incorrect facts, they are undermining democracy, which makes a certain amount of sense. You can see how people got there. It leads you very quickly to a weird paradox, which is that in order to have a fully functioning, transparent democracy, you need to be out there censoring anyone who puts out incorrect facts. And suddenly that doesn't seem like liberal democracy anymore.
Exactly. And we saw this during COVID. Remember Jacinda Ardern, who said that her government was the single source of truth. And it's not that we're sitting here thinking, okay, there isn't such a thing as people who are deliberately putting malicious content online. Obviously, we all know that that takes place. But the solution is worse than the problem, because the solution is that it will be regulated top-down, and that there will be essentially gatekeepers put in place for the information that you and I can receive, which is far worse than the situation of just being flooded with false information that we have to wade through ourselves.
So you've been watching the playbook, or the sequence of steps that tends to come before these new measures, these new slightly censorious measures. And I think it's a good thing for the audience to pay attention to, because it means we can all be on the lookout for it.
Right.
Next time you hear one of these things, your ears should prick up and you think, this is now that happening again. Talk us through those steps.
The first step is that there is a perceived threat is announced, and so there's the idea that something bad is happening. So it could be that our democracy is being threatened, or it could be the dangers of hate speech. Invariably, this threat is on the rise. It's always on the rise. There's been a recent surge in this. There's been a recent uptick in that, and typically what happens is that statement that this threat is always on the rise is backed up by statistics from NGOs that are often funded by the institutions announcing the threat in the first place. And so these NGOs have done these studies or whatever.
So, for example, they'd be saying hate speech is on the rise. A new report shows that either it would be anti-Semitic or anti-women or anti-Muslim, Islamophobia. All of those kind of things, they're on the rise. A new study has come out that shows a 40% increase.
Exactly.
And that is used to bolster the idea that there is a sort of urgent, pressing problem.
Exactly. And it's always on the rise. And so Ursula von der Leyen's speech in 2021 to the European Parliament on hate is hate. So if you read the transcript of that speech, the first paragraph or two is just littered with footnotes referring to according to this study, according to that study.
But what if it is on the rise? Some people will be watching this thinking, those guys are laughing at the idea that hate speech is on the rise. There's a lot of hate speech about. People are being kind of pretty awful to each other on the internet. What if those statistics are true?
So, firstly, I've got huge question marks about how this data is collected. Secondly, there's no definition of hate speech. So as long as it's malleable, then you can always say something's on the rise depending on how broadly you define something. It is true that at certain points in history that some things might be worse or better. But all I would say is in the 15 years I've been researching on this, year on year, it's always on the rise.
Right.
And so I've read enough of these announcements now to see it not just as they're pointing out a legitimate social phenomenon, but I have seen that it's very much part of the playbook to then introduce what comes next.
Well, what comes next?
Which is we have to introduce some new form of censorship to deal with this new problem. And what's interesting is they never refer to the existing array of laws that already exist to censor speech. Because you would think the way that they announce this is that there's just no tools in their toolbox, so there's no choice. So they have to enact some new thing. But in fact, all Western governments, these international institutions, have got decades of passing more and more speech restrictions. But they always announce some plan to counter the threat. And then what we see is that at the international level, doing that through hard law, through treaty law, is very difficult.
Proper laws.
Proper laws. It has to be negotiated by different countries. You have to take those positions into account. It has to be voted on. And then we can say the equivalent at the national level. It's quite hard passing primary legislation through Parliament because of the messiness of democracy. The final step in the process is to have some form of regulations or agreements or code of conducts that are enforced often, in a sense, through the private sector. And that's where we're seeing this rise in things like these, the Digital Compact or the EU's Code of Conduct.
It's like a kind of Russian doll. To get away from the instant democracy of the national level, you then go to the higher international organisation. But then even at that level, to get a proper UN or EU law passed is too difficult. So you then go to another level of abstraction, which is some kind of
bureaucracy combined with the private sector. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's exactly. That's a really good way of putting it. And by that point, to go back to something you said earlier, you are now so many steps removed from the demos, from the citizen. You've just gone one Russian doll after another until there's just such a big gap. You and I cannot help somehow affect change in the EU's code of conduct that it drafted with big tech companies.
18th of June 2024. This is recent news, hot off the press. The UN Secretary-General gave a message on the International Day for Countering Hate. I didn't know there was such a day, but apparently there is. And there you saw exactly this playbook. Talk us through it.
Yeah, exactly. So the UN Secretary-General, 2 days ago from this recording, announced hate speech is a marker of discrimination, abuse, violence, conflict, and even crimes against humanity. We've seen this play out from Nazi Germany to Rwanda, Bosnia, and beyond, which, by the way, is often what they refer to as the reason for doing this, so is Germany, Rwanda. And then comes the always-on-the-rise switch. Recent months have seen an upsurge in both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate speech online, in public comments by influential leaders. So there's that. And then finally, rather than say, therefore, we're going to use what we already have, it's therefore, here's this new thing. So now the latest is, therefore, the United Nations is currently preparing global principles for information integrity. Again, not hard law, very hard to pass, to guide decision makers around these issues.
So you're a lawyer, you've been working in this area, as you say, for 15 years. Is it getting more so? Do you feel like, are these tendencies deepening?
Sadly, yes. I'm optimistic by disposition. but we have to recognise what's happening. The censorship is on the rise, and we see that.
Do you have a study to prove that? Or?
I have many statistics, but I think I showed here, it's the constancy of passing new codes, new reports, new laws. Almost every week there is a new thing that is being adopted that is in some way building on the censorship apparatus that they've been building for many years.
So you highlight there are some examples where you've managed to be successful to push back against this mission creep. There's one example to do with the pandemic treaty.
When you're able to engage with the member states at these international bodies, and then you're dealing with real people who have real constituents, then I think it's possible to see change. And we have seen from the original draft of the WHO pandemic treaty very bad language on misinformation, disinformation. Over a series of drafts, all of it got removed because member states said, we don't want this in the treaty.
Because voters at that level don't tend to like censorship.
Exactly. And so really the lesson for all of us is, I would say, two things. One, visibility. So shining a light on what's happening is so important because so much of what happens at these international bodies goes unreported, nobody knows, nobody cares, but it affects them. And then the second is, where possible, and this is the same at the international and the national level, is to try and slow the process down. What I've seen over the years is a lot of the censorship happens when things are rushed through very quickly. Once the breaks start coming in play and people start asking questions like, how do you define hate speech? Oh, you don't define it, but you want to ban it. How do you define misinformation? And so forth. That slowing down of the process can actually help protect free speech.
I think there are two schools of thought as to how all this came about, even among critics of the anti-disinformation movement. The first is that it has been pushed by part of some kind of elaborate plan to control populations. There are secret meetings or meeting networks of highly influential people who agree common cause and common forms of language that is then passed down through organizations like the UN and the World Economic Forum, etc., down to eventually their lowest servants, the national leaders, who then execute them. There's that view, and then there is another view, which is the idea that it's actually more of a reflection of the kind of place our societies are in. In the West in particular, earlier principles that we all felt bound us and we felt were core to our society, such as free speech, relied on a sort of confidence that has gone. Where do you stand on that, working in amongst all of these organisations? Do you think it's more driven, or do you think it's more emergent?
I've not traced and tracked some web of connected parties and what have you. That's not what I've tried to do. But what I have seen is things happening in parallel across the whole world that would not reasonably considered to be organic and from the bottom up. So legislation, online safety bills with the exact same titles and wording being passed in countries almost at the same time. The fact
Is that not just copycat politics? Now that we're all so closely connected, everyone meets at these summits, everyone wants to follow quote-unquote best practice. Oh, Australia's just done a very clever thing to counter disinformation. We better do that. Is that not still emergent?
It could be, but I think that if you were to look up the spate of misinformation laws that have been adopted in the last 5 years, yeah, you could say, well, they're all just copying each other. I mean, I suppose, how do we know? They're all copying each other, or there is a degree of coordination. Now, what I would say from the international side is it doesn't need to be a conspiracy to say that these countries have signed up to, and in a sense, ceded some of their sovereignty to international institutions, and that is the top-down that we're talking about. When the EU passes something and says that all 27 countries in the EU has to do it, that's a top-down situation happening. When the UN passes, or seeking to pass, it's not succeeded yet, the WHO pandemic treaty, again, that is coordinating action across the globe. And in a sense, that's what these international institutions were set up to do.
So give us the worst, then. I mean, I think we have to consider that scenario. What is the sort of darkest reading of this? And what should we be most worried about? What would a worst-case scenario look like?
I mentioned two streams. and you could tie some others into there as well. And I think that the worst that I see is essentially the groundwork or the framework being laid in Western democracies for a Chinese-style social credit system. This is a society that is completely controlled through technology from the top down, and it is done through a series of actions that over time means that you are plugged into a system that it is very hard to get out of and live outside of that system. And I see a lot of the regulations that are being put in place, combined with a lot of the emergent technology, moving us closer into that direction. Now, we're not there yet, but in terms of where do I see all of this potentially heading towards, it would be that. And it's what de Tocqueville referred to as a soft tyranny, which we could summarize as saying an ordered slavery.
How confident are you that we can avoid that?
I don't know the answer. Honestly, because...
You're at the coalface. Do you feel you're retreating or advancing?
We're not advancing. We're not advancing, but one of the lessons of history is it's full of surprises, and it's full of situations that happen where it looked like a future was inevitable that wasn't. And one area that I draw hope from is, in both of our lifetimes, the fall of the Berlin Wall. No one predicted. No one. None of the talking heads, none of the podcasters, no one at the time predicted that was going to happen.
There weren't so many podcasts in 1989.
But if there hadn't been, no one was predicting it. And so I think that although a lot of what we're talking about is trending in a certain direction, I never take the position that this is inevitable, that somehow we're just sleepwalking into a future that's already been written.
So we should continue to fight the good fight.
Absolutely.
Paul Coleman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Paul Coleman of the ADF giving us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the large international institutions that seem quite enamoured by a anti-disinformation / censorship agenda. I'm always conscious when talking about this stuff that we don't want to suddenly create an overly imaginative conspiratorial worldview. But I've got to say, when you hear the way these organisations work, how removed they are from the cleansing effect of public votes, how complex they are almost by design, and how so many of these initiatives are just full of jargon that you and I may not even understand, it does make you anxious, to say the least. And I think the more we can understand it and the more we can shine a light on it, if we can stay awake through all of the complex descriptions of these almost deliberately boring-sounding entities, the better we'll be at combating it and pushing back. So thank you to Paul Coleman, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.